Hello everyone, it's great to see you in 3D. You all look much better with that. Really great to be here and slowly getting back to some semblance of normality. So thank you for coming and thank you for everyone who is still listening to us on Zoom. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Wilma Bainbridge. So unlike many of the people that I normally introduce, I do not know her from like 10 years ago. I actually met her like 2 years ago. But I do have a story, so wait for it. So the first thing I would say about her is that she is currently an assistant professor at the Department of Psychology at the University of Chicago. She is the PI of, listen to this, the Bainbridge Lab, so rejoice. Her work is amazing, works at the intersection of perception and memory and studies this thing called memorability that she's going to tell us a whole lot about. So obviously I'm super excited about her research. Before moving to Chicago, she was a postdoc at the NIH with Louise Baker, and before that she did her PhD at MIT working with the super amazing Aude Olivia. And before that, she worked at the Humanoids Robotics Laboratory at the University of Tokyo. How cool is that? And right after, and she did that right after finishing her undergrad at Yale. She's published over 30 publications in top venues. Her research is super cool, but I just wanted to mention two small things. They're not that small when you are from this perspective. I am now an editor in 2 journals, and getting reviewers is hard, it's very hard. And Wilma has been amazing at reviewing many of the papers, and some of the nicest reviews and most constructive reviews have come from her. And the last thing I would say about like when I met her, it was actually with Roberto at CNS. We had dinner, and I was kind of nervous because I really like her work, and it is just kind of hard sometimes when you meet someone that you really admire, whose work you really admire, and it turns out to not be nice. Well, she is like also incredibly nice. In addition to being a wonderful researcher and a wonderful person, she's also really good. So. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Bainbridge, who's going to be talking today about memorability, how images drive our memories.
Thank you, Felipe. That was one of the nicest introductions I've ever heard, and it's good to know my reviews are okay. Okay, so a lot of you are probably very familiar with scenes like this. This is actually the first time I'm giving a talk not in a context like this, so I guess we still have some participants on Zoom. And so when you're in these Zoom meetings and you're encountering tons of faces, you'll often see some faces where you clearly remember seeing them from a prior meeting. But then there might also be some other faces where you've seen them in many meetings before, but you struggle to remember who that person is. And in fact, many of us might have this intuition that some people stick in our memory more easily than others. So to illustrate this idea, I'm going to run a little visual memory task on you guys, so get your hands ready. I'm going to show you a stream of face images, and I want you to clap your hands when you recognize a face from earlier in the stream. It's not necessarily going to be back to back, so clap your hands when you recognize a face image. Okay, ready? Okay, here we go. Good, you guys are paying attention, that's good. You're doing the task. Oh, good. Interesting. This is great because I always do it over Zoom, so I can only see a few people's videos, but it was great to hear the auditory feedback. So even though this was a lot of your first time seeing these faces, you actually played right into my trap. You acted just like I was going to, that I predicted how you would act. So for this face, I put her in there as an attention check to get you guys used to the task. This was a relatively easy one. Actually, I'm not sure if I really fooled many of you for this face. So no one clapped for her face. I saw some of you be ready to clap. And that's what I would expect because I know this face causes a lot of false memories. In contrast for this face, you guys did an amazing job, and that's what I expect because I know this is a really memorable face. But you guys had a really long delay and not everyone clapped for her face, even though I did also show her face twice. But I know she has a pretty forgettable face, so many people fail to clap for her face. Yeah. And so what this illustrates is that there's this intrinsic property of images that I call memorability, which reflects the likelihood for remembering a given item. And so today in my talk, I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour telling you about what is this property of image memorability. I'm then going to go into what makes something memorable. And then I'm going to show you some recent work looking at consistencies in false memory as well. So you might be wondering, what is this memorability? Well, how we can empirically test whether you can consider memorability as some intrinsic property to images is I can run tons of people online in an experiment just like what you guys did. So we assembled this large-scale face database. If any of you do face research, feel free to hit me up for this data set. It has over 10,000 faces representing the US population in terms of demographics. We then took these over 10,000 faces and put them into a large-scale online memory experiment where participants did just what you guys did. They saw a stream of faces, and then instead of clapping, they pressed a button whenever they saw a repeated face. And in that button press, we get the hit rate, or the proportion of people who correctly recognize the image. Also, in that first presentation of the image, we get the false alarm rate, or the proportion of people who had a false memory for that face. And so the key question is, how consistent is memory performance across observers? Do we remember and forget the same images? So to look at this question, we do something we call a split half consistency analysis. So you can take all of your participants and split them into two random halves. And so the question is, do these two halves remember and forget the same images? So to look at this, you can sort the images for one half of the participants from the images they remembered best to the images they remembered worst. And so the key question is, if you sort the images in that same order for the second group of participants, do they show the same curve? If they don't show similarities, we'd see something like this. So this is our estimate of chance. But if we plot that second group of participants, this is what we see. Indeed, the two groups remember the same images and forget the same images. And we can compute a Spearman rank correlation between the two groups, and we find this significant rho Spearman's rank correlation of 0.68 between what group 1 and group 2 remembers. So this shows us that people remember and forget the same images, and therefore you can consider something like memorability as intrinsic to a face image. Like this image will be remembered by about 60% of people or 80% of people. So you might wonder, how widespread is this effect? I've shown you it for faces so far. Well, we also see these effects for scene photographs, face identities. So if you're highly memorable when you're smiling, you're also memorable when you're looking away. Some work has found this in complex visualizations like infographics. But we've also seen these memorability effects in stimuli like words that have very rich semantic information, but relatively sparse visual information. And in some recent work, we even find that there's memorable and forgettable dance moves, whether the actual dancer, like ballerina, is making that move, or if a stick figure is making that same move. So you might be wondering, how impactful is the memorability of that stimulus? Well, here's some behavioral results that we found. So we found that memorable images show a boost in memory as quickly as just showing them for 13 milliseconds. But these effects also last as long as a week or longer. So if something's memorable a minute later, it's also memorable a week later. We also find that you can measure memorability scores in one task and then translate it to another task or another population. So for example, I showed you memorability scores measured in a continuous recognition task, but it will also predict what people remember when you have separate study and test phases, for example. And we even find that memorability influences memory during incidental memory tasks. So even if your participants are not being told to remember an item, they will still remember the memorable ones later, or better, if you give them a surprise memory task. We also find that these effects cannot be overridden with a reward. So even if I pay you money, you're not going to remember the forgettable images or forget the memorable ones. And in some recent work, we also find that the memorability of the images you're looking at has a stronger influence on what you'll remember than your current attentional state. So even if you're not really paying attention, you'll still remember these memorable items. And so hopefully I've convinced you that you can think of memorability as a very stable property to an image. And that means in theory that memorability is also directly computable from an image. So in some recent work, in collaboration with my master's student, Koa Nidell, he's developed a deep learning neural network called ResMem that is now the current state of the art in predicting memorability scores. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the neural network, but basically it combines a shallow neural network for detecting low-level visual features, and then also a deeper residual neural network for getting into the more semantic, deeper features of the images. And if you visit my website here, you can upload any of your pictures and get back the predicted memorability scores. So yeah, if you're curious about how memorable your stimuli are, or if they're well counterbalanced, feel free to check out our resource there. And if you're curious, how well does this network actually do at predicting people's memory? Well, here's the performance for the prior model that was developed back in 2015 by computer vision scientists at MIT. And so in blue here is human performance, is sort of ground truth. And then in orange are the predictions from that network. And here's how our current network performs. And you can see really there's a lot of overlap. And we find a correlation of 0.68 between our predictions made by our neural network and people's actual memory performance scores. And we can do some feature visualization to look at what our network's actually picking up on. And indeed, we find in our early, shallower layers, we're seeing sensitivity to low-level visual features like oriented edges. And then in later layers, we're seeing sensitivity to more abstract object types like face sensitivity. And this is what's being seen in a lot of visually based neural networks as well. Yeah, so I've given you a whirlwind tour of what is memorability, but I'm sure many of you are curious about what makes something memorable. And this is actually still a big open question in our lab right now. So in some of our early work, looking back at face memorability, we're curious if some of the famous attributes studied in the field of faces might be able to describe memorability in some way. So for these thousands of faces, we got online ratings for the faces for a range of visual attributes, like how attractive is the face, also memory-related attributes, like how distinctive the face is, or how much someone thinks they will remember the face, so subjective ratings of memorability. We also got ratings for more higher-level properties like trustworthiness and dominance. And so if we combine all of these attributes into one model, we were curious how well could we predict the memorability of a face. So here I'm going to show you a pie of basically how variance is sliced up in people's memory behavior. So first, what we find is that a good 50% of the variance in what you'll remember and forget is really determined by the image, by this intrinsic memorability. While the other half of the variance are these other factors you might imagine, like your own prior experiences, the environment, other potential remaining sources of variance. Now, if we take this attributes model, we find that it only explains less than half of the variance in memorability. So while there are some attributes that are correlated with memorability, so for example, we don't find that attractiveness is correlated with memorability, but we do find that having a mean face is correlated with being more memorable. But even though we see these correlations, these attributes don't really explain what makes something memorable. And so you can definitely have a kind, unmemorable face as well. We've been now revisiting these questions using a larger set of images, now in the space of objects. So this is a study led by my master's student, Max Kramer, where we're using the things database to look at what sort of features might make an item memorable. And so the things database is this great data set of 26,000 object images. This was developed by Martin Habart and colleagues at the Max Planck Institute. And what's great about this data set is that it essentially captures all concrete objects. They scraped all of the concrete nouns from an English dictionary and then downloaded images for each one of those concrete nouns. And they also used a data-driven approach to derive 49 dimensions that organize people's behavioral similarity spaces for these objects. So basically, these 49 dimensions tell us how we represent these different objects in our mental representations. And so we're curious, how do these 49 dimensions relate to memorability of an image? So we put these 26,000 images online, got memorability scores for all of them, and what we found was that even combining all of these 49 dimensions, we could only explain 61.7% of the variance in memorability. So while these dimensions do relate to memorability, it's not just that memorability is some linear combination of a bunch of attributes. One thing we also found was that these semantic features, so for example, if an item was, or an object was animate or a tool, explain a vast majority of the variance in comparison to visual attributes like if it is a colorful object or if it's a flat object. So this seems to suggest that these more semantic features play a bigger role in what we remember and forget than visual features. So while we don't have yet a great feature-based model for predicting memorability, we were curious if we might see something interesting if we looked into the brain. Do we see patterns in the brain related to seeing memorable versus forgettable items? So to look at this question, we ran a rapid event-related design where participants actually engaged in a purely perceptual task. So they saw face and scene images, and for the faces, they just had to categorize if the face was male or female. And then for the scenes, they had to categorize if the scene was indoors or outdoors. So purely perceptual task, no memory component. But behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the participants, actually half of our images were highly forgettable and half were highly memorable. And we determined this from a separate online experiment just like the one you guys saw earlier and engaged in slightly earlier. And one key thing is that we made sure to match for all sorts of other attributes between the forgettable and memorable items. So for example, our forgettable and memorable faces were matched for gender, race, age, attractiveness, friendliness, color, spatial frequency. And actually here are the average faces of each of the two conditions. And you can see really they're indistinguishable from each other. Similarly for the scenes, we controlled for things like category, indoor, outdoor, natural, man-made, spatial frequency, color, number of objects, size of objects. And you can really see that these are well matched. And here are the average images for the forgettable and memorable scenes. And again, you can see there's not really any visual differences here. And so we also, after we took participants out of the scanner, we gave them a surprise recognition task to see what individual participants remembered and forgot. And so the key thing is that we can then group our trials in two ways. We can group them based on the memorability of the stimulus as determined from that separate online experiment from a totally separate set of individuals. Or we can group trials based on what individuals in the scanner remembered and forgot specifically. And so our first question was, do we see sensitivity anywhere in the brain to the memorability of an image? So I'm first going to show you some blank brains just to orient you. So here's an axial view, so it's sort of like this through your head, right? And here's a sagittal view, so it's a side view through your head. And so I'm going to show you a contrast of where we see higher activity for memorable items in orange. And so what we see is this nice bilateral swath of activation. First, importantly, we don't see any overlap with early visual cortex, which we know is sensitive to things like edges and orientations. So this is sort of a good sanity check to show us there's no visual differences between our memorable and forgettable items. But we see this bilateral swath does extend into late visual areas like inferior temporal cortex, regions like the fusiform face area and parahippocampal place area that are sensitive to faces and scenes. And then it also extends into these memory-related areas like the parahippocampal cortex, anterior hippocampus, and pararhinal cortex. So this suggests to us that we are seeing sensitivity to memorability in late visual areas and memory-related areas. So you might be thinking, perhaps this might reflect subsequent memory effects that we've seen previously in the literature, where you contrast what individual participants remember and forget. If that's the case, then we shouldn't see these patterns if we look at the items that people actually forgot. Because if they forgot the items, then you shouldn't see anything if this is just a subsequent memory effect. So we can look at the same contrast, but split up the contrast based on what people in the scanner remembered and people in the scanner forgot. And if we look at this contrast, it's identical between the two. So no matter if you remembered or forgot the image, if it's a memorable image, you'll see this strong activation in these late visual and memory areas. So this really shows us it's not something about what that person in the scanner remembered and forgot. It's something about that perceptual experience of the image. So what I've shown you so far are just activation differences. So this might suggest something like, oh, memorable items might drive attention, and that's why we see higher activity. But what we're really interested in is why might these regions be sensitive to memorability, and how might memorability be actually represented in these regions? And so we can use something like representational similarity analysis, or RSA, to look at how these individual stimuli are actually represented in these regions. And so there's a few different hypotheses you might imagine. First, you might imagine something like type similarity, where memorable items are similar to each other, forgettable items are similar to each other, and those two groups are dissimilar from each other. This is like what you'd see for faces and scenes, right? Where faces are similar, scenes are similar, the two groups are dissimilar. You might also imagine different levels of variance or different levels of clustering within each of these groups. But you might also imagine a representation like this, a sort of nested representation where perhaps memorable items are very similar and forgettable items are dissimilar, or the opposite, where maybe forgettable items are very self-similar and memorable items are very distinctive, right? And so we can test all of these hypotheses using something called hypothesis-driven representational similarity analysis, or you might have heard of RSA before. And how this works is we rove a spherical searchlight throughout the brain, and within each of those spheres, we extract a matrix that we call here a representational similarity matrix, or RSM. And what that matrix is built up of is each cell is a correlation of the voxel patterns for two stimuli, for a pair of stimuli. And so each one of these cells represents a correlation between each combination of stimulus pair. And so what you end up with is a matrix representing which images are similar and which images are dissimilar in the neural patterns in that region in the brain. And so with this matrix showing us our representational geometries, we can then correlate it with these different hypotheses we have about what the representational geometries might look like. These are just cartoon matrices. And then you can see where in the brain do we see significant correlations with one hypothesis versus another. And so we then run this analysis with different hypotheses like the one I showed you in the previous slide, where maybe memorable items are very similar to each other and forgettable ones are very dissimilar. And so first we looked in many regions of interest, like our late visual areas in the inferior temporal cortex and memory areas. And we actually only saw significant correlations with one hypothesis in all of these regions. And that was this hypothesis, that memorable items are similar to each other and forgettable items are dissimilar. Here I'll actually show you the searchlight results for where we found significant correlations with that hypothesis. And so indeed, we see this pattern where memorable items are similar, forgettable ones are dissimilar in these late visual areas and these memory areas in the medial temporal lobe. And we find this not just in the study I showed you, but we're also able to replicate these patterns by reanalyzing data from Jesse Risman and colleagues, where they had participants do a face retrieval task in the scanner. We took those pre-existing data, got memorability scores for the faces, did the same analysis, and again found the same representational pattern of memorability in these late visual areas and medial temporal lobe areas. And if you're curious what happens if we look at what individuals in the scanner remembered and forgot, well, we found those representations were more present in these frontal and parietal areas. So we found this dissociation between representations of that image's memorability and what that person remembered and forgot. So you might imagine this representational geometry I've shown you is sort of counterintuitive. You would think memorable things should be very distinctive, not that memorable things should be similar and forgettable things should be distinctive, right? So why might it be that memorable items are more similar to each other? And so one of my friends and colleagues, Zain Shia, approached me with this idea that perhaps memorability reflects how our memory is organized and how we search our memory spaces. And so in this study led by Zain, we looked at whether memorability could reflect something like where you are in a memory network. So for example, now in the realm of words, you might imagine that our representations of words are organized something like this, where words that co-occur or are semantically connected, so words that occur together in a lot of sentences, might be highly connected, while words that don't tend to occur together in sentences don't have a connection. And perhaps the items that occur with many words, or the ones that have many semantic connections with many other words, are at the roots of our network, while those that don't occur with many other words would be at the leaves of our network. And this is often captured in something in computational linguistics called global vectors for word representation. That's one way to quantify where a word is in this network space. But our idea here was maybe memorability might reflect something about where we are in this memory network. So to look at this question, we ran a study now with words where participants studied pairs of concrete nouns like beam and pumpkin. They then engaged in an unrelated math distractor task. And then afterwards, they performed a recall task where they would see one of the words and then had to verbally recall the word that was paired with it. So if you saw a beam, you would have to say out loud pumpkin. And what's great about this task and using words is that you can look at representations and performance for this recalled item without ever showing the recalled item. So here we can really look at memory representations without any perceptual influences of that item, of seeing the word pumpkin. And so we ran this task in 2 samples. We ran it online on Amazon Mechanical Turk with over 2,600 participants. But we also ran this task with 30 epileptic patients with intracranial electrode implants. This allowed us to look at the patterns within specific neuronal populations we were interested in. So first, you might be wondering, I've made all these claims that memorability is very consistent even across participants, but these are 2 very different participant pools. So is performance, or people's what they remember and forget, really consistent within and across these different samples? So first, we were able to replicate this memory consistency in our online sample. So essentially, group 1 and group 2, group 1 isn't shown here, it's just implied here, but basically, if you split people into 2 random halves, they remember and forget the same words. And we also find this within our patients with intracranial electrode implants. And importantly, we also find significant correlations between the 2 samples. So even though these are 2 very different samples of people, they tend to remember and forget the same words as each other. And so indeed, we can consider memorability as intrinsic to these words. And so our next question was, does this glove model capture memorability well? Or might there be some other linguistic measure that relates better to memorability? So for example, you might imagine something like word frequency might be highly related to memorability. You might think maybe rarer words like platypus might be more memorable than a more common word like cat. You might also imagine that word concreteness could be related to memorability. So maybe a more concrete word like cat might be more memorable than a more abstract word like dream. So we pitted these 3 measures against each other, and what we found was that the semantic connectedness model was the only one that was able to significantly explain memorability. We actually saw, if you pit these 3 against each other, that frequency and concreteness did not ultimately play a role in what was memorable or forgettable. So this suggests to us that memorable words do tend to be these words that are at the roots of the network, and forgettable ones tend to be the ones at the leaves. And if this is in fact the case, there are several predictions we might make, both in behavior and in what we'd see in these electrodes. So first, you would predict that memorable words should be recalled faster in behavior, because the idea is that when you're retrieving an item, you start at the roots of the network, then you traverse it, and then get out to the leaves, right? And so this is indeed what we find. We find a significant correlation between memorability and lower reaction time. So people are faster to recall the memorable items than the forgettable items. You would also predict that when retrieval fails, people should falsely recall the memorable items more frequently. If you're just randomly searching around the space, you will tend to pick a word more in the center than the outsides if you can't remember the actual word. And this is indeed what we found. We found a significant higher memorability of intrusions, these false recollections that people would make. And then finally, highly related to the first prediction here, you would predict that memorable words should be reinstated earlier in the brain than forgettable words. And so to measure reinstatement, this is when we turned to the patients with the intracranial electrode implants. And they all had electrodes implanted along the temporal lobe, exactly these regions we had been seeing in fMRI for being sensitive to memorability. And so to measure reinstatement, what we can look at is when signals between encoding and retrieval are similar. Because the idea is that when you're reinstating an item, then your pattern during retrieval will resemble your pattern during encoding of that same item. And so our prediction here would be that we would see reinstatement in these electrodes occurring earlier for memorable items than forgettable items. And so this is indeed what we see. We see that the peak for reinstating memorable items is significantly earlier than the peak for reinstating forgettable items. So this suggests to us that memorability may represent the organization of our memory space, where memorable items are the first items we search in that space. So going back to that question of, so what is memorability? Well, our current working hypothesis is that memorability is a highly consistent image property that's measurable and replicable across tasks, stimuli, and population. And it may be a marker of how perceptual information is prioritized in memory. Specifically, it might be a measure of where items are in a memory network, where the most semantically connected items are at the roots, and the most forgettable, unconnected items are at the leaves. Okay, so now that we've allowed a bit of time to pass, I'm going to test your memory for those face images I showed you at the beginning of the talk. So this will be a hand-raising task. So I'm going to show you 3 faces. For each one of them, raise your hand if you remember seeing it earlier in the stream. Okay, so raise your hand if you remember seeing this face. Okay, see a few hands. Okay, oh, I see more hands. Okay, so 5-ish people. Raise your hands if you remember seeing this face. Okay, and then raise your hands if you remember seeing this face. Okay, so I think I caught a good proportion of you. So actually, you didn't see any of these faces. Yeah. So these are faces that I know cause a lot of false memories. So yeah, I'm glad I actually caught some of you guys. So in the last part of my talk, I'm going to tell you about false memories and some very recent research we have going on looking at, do we show consistencies also in the images that we make false memories to? And so you might remember I showed you at the beginning of the talk this split half consistency analysis to show that people are really consistent in the images they remember and forget. Well, if we do the same analysis for false alarm rates, we also find that people are really consistent in the faces they make false memories to or don't make false memories to. And indeed, the correlation between 2 random halves of participants is 0.69, so a very high correlation. And so in some recent work, we've been really interested in thinking about what factors cause false memories. And so this is work led by my lab manager, Deepa Prasad. And instead of looking at faces, we were really intrigued by this cultural phenomenon that you might have seen in social media, specifically called the Mandela effect. So now my final memory test for you guys. I'm going to show you some images and see what your memories are for these highly familiar icons. So I'm going to show you 3 images. I want you to hold up a 1, 2, or 3 for which one is the correct image of that icon. Don't overthink it, just give me your instinctual response. Okay, so which is the Fruit of the Loom logo, 1, 2, or 3? Okay, so I see a majority of 1s, which is indeed what most people think. But the correct answer is 3. Yeah. So there is no cornucopia in the Fruit of the Loom logo. Okay, so how about for the Monopoly Man? Is it 1, 2, or 3? Does he have glasses, a monocle, or no eyewear? I see a lot of 2s, but I also see some 3s, maybe because you've read about the Mandela effect, because indeed he does not have any eyewear, even though most people have a false memory that he has a monocle. And then finally, which one of these 3 is the correct Pikachu? So I'm sure many of you watch the show or play the games. Is it 1, 2, or 3? Oh, I see. Actually, it seems like maybe most people are getting it right here, but majority of people would say number 3 is the correct Pikachu, but it's actually number 1. Yeah. And so These examples illustrate this really fascinating phenomenon, which we call the visual Mandela effect, or VME. Specifically, what we're seeing is that there are some icons for which people make a consistent false memory, and this is widespread across individuals, despite never or rarely experiencing this false version. So you have probably never seen this logo, or this logo, or these three images, yet you have a striking false memory that this is what you always see when you put on clothes from Fruit of the Loom, right? For another fun one, C-3PO actually has a silver leg. He's not gold entirely. And so while this visual Mandela effect has been discussed a lot in pop culture, it's actually never been empirically studied. Or the only scientific paper about it is about how we've actually switched dimensions because we have this consistent false memory across people. So we were curious, how widespread and consistent is this effect really? Because many of you were getting correct answers. And we were also curious, what are the drivers of this effect? And so to look at how widespread the phenomenon is, we ran an online study with 40 different icons in which we made 3 different versions of the icon. We had the original correct version of the icon, we had a manipulation, and if there was a Mandela effect version out in pop culture, we would use that version. And then we also made a matched manipulation. And what's important here is that we made sure to counterbalance our manipulation types. So you couldn't just infer that the version lacking a feature was the correct version. We then asked participants to indicate which was the correct version, and then also tell us how confident they were in their response and how familiar they were with the icon. And so we created examples of 40 different icons. So I'm going to show you a bar graph of people's tendency to respond for these 3 different options across these 40 different icons. And you don't need to read this graph into too much detail, but basically what we find is that there are 7 icons in our set of 40 for which a majority of people are choosing manipulation 1 as the correct version over the original image or other manipulation. We then did a consistency analysis, just like what I've shown you in previous slides, so splitting participants into random halves and seeing how consistent they were in their behavior. But here we looked at consistency for choosing that incorrect version, rather than consistency for making the correct response. And what we found was that for these 7 icons, people were significantly consistently choosing the wrong version. So they were choosing that wrong version over half of the time amongst having those 3 different examples. So this shows us that there is a set of images where people are consistently choosing a wrong image to represent what's in their memory. So you might imagine maybe people are making these errors because they're not very familiar with the character. So we then looked at how accuracy related to confidence in their response and familiarity with the character. So here I'm going to show you a scatter plot for all of our icons, comparing accuracy and confidence. And here are those 7 images that cause a Mandela effect. And our range for confidence was actually 1 to 5. So what we actually find is for these 7 images, people are very inaccurate because they're picking the wrong image, but they're also relatively confident about their choice. They're giving us a rating of 3.5 to 4 out of 5. And we see the same thing for familiarity. People rate that they're pretty familiar with the icon, yet they're still choosing the wrong version. So even though people are making these errors, they're very confident and familiar for these specific images. And while I've shown you that people make these errors when they're choosing, where they're doing a recognition-based test, where they're choosing amongst different options, we also wanted to see if people spontaneously created these errors. So we also asked a separate set of over 400 participants to draw these characters from memory. And what we find is, when they're drawing the icons, they also spontaneously produce these errors. So they draw the Monopoly man with the monocle. And you can see people actually really know the character very well. I would say these are really good drawings of Pikachu, but they still have that incorrect black tip on the tail. And then finally, we also do see the cornucopia and the Fruit of the Loom logo. And so people are spontaneously making these errors when asked to recall. And importantly, we had no image cue here. Our task was just draw Pikachu. Like we never showed a Pikachu, and they still make these errors. So what might be the drivers of this effect? So first you might wonder, are there visual differences in the VME images? Because maybe people's attention might be captured by very salient features. So we looked at if there were differences between the original version and the Mandela effect version for all sorts of low-level visual features. We found no difference in spatial frequency or edge information, no difference in the number of non-white pixels, so it's not like there was more stuff for one version or another. And we saw no differences in color for red, green, or blue. Okay, but perhaps people are attending to these images differently. Maybe people are missing that feature, they're not looking at Pikachu's tail, and they're filling in details from a schema. So to look at this question, we ran an online task similar to eye tracking, but instead we did something called mouse tracking using mouse view. So basically participants saw a white screen, but if they moved their mouse around, they would reveal under it an aperture showing them a picture underneath. So we would very rapidly flash a picture of Pikachu and then ask them to explore the picture of Pikachu covered by this white screen. They had to explore the image for at least 5 seconds, and then once they felt they were done exploring the image, they could continue on to the next image. And we told them to study the images in as much detail as possible. We didn't tell them what we were going to test them on. And so we showed them the 40 correct versions of the images, only the correct version, so Pikachu without the black tip on the tail. And then right afterwards, we gave them a memory test of what had they just seen. And we would give them either the original one or the Mandela effect version for their 2 options. And we looked at whether there were differences in people's viewing behavior for when they made correct or incorrect choices. And so here are some example heat maps where red are where there were more fixations when someone was correct, and blue is when there were more fixations when someone was incorrect. And essentially what we found is that there were no differences. So you would have predicted maybe there'd be more red here looking at the tail. Like maybe when people are getting it right, it's because they're looking at Pikachu's tail. But we actually find no difference in viewing behavior related to anything, not related to whether people were correct or incorrect, whether they responded for the Mandela effect or non-Mandela effect image, no statistical interactions. So the crazy thing here is that people are viewing the feature, but then making the wrong choice right afterwards. Because we were able to replicate our effect in this short-term memory paradigm. Even if you see the right picture, you still choose the wrong version just a few minutes later. And we don't see differences in visual experience. So it's not that people are not looking at his tail. They look at it and they make this error. So since many of you might have heard of the Mandela effect, maybe it's possible that people have seen examples of the Mandela effect before, and they've encoded those versions as the correct version. So they've actually seen this incorrect Pikachu in an article about the VME, and then they're having a source memory error. So to look at this, we also performed an experiment where we automatically scraped hundreds of images from Google Images for each of our icons, and then quantified how many of them showed the visual Mandela effect. So here's the example for Pikachu. You might argue maybe this version shows the visual Mandela effect, though you can see that his tail is not that characteristic thunderbolt shape, it's a heart shape. And so what we found was that for all items, the majority of images were the canonical image. So even if people had seen the Mandela effect version before, that's still a very rare version that they had seen that they're encoding into memory. And we also found that for most images, examples of the VME were very rare, or we would not find any examples of the VME. And often they'd originate from an article about this effect, which suggests that actually the memory phenomenon preceded the coverage of the event or the phenomenon in an article, right? Like the effect had to exist first before they wrote about it. So with the visual Mandela effect, what we're finding is that people are showing this widespread memory error for a consistent feature in spite of their high familiarity and confidence. We find that these errors are not solely due to visual features, attention differences, prior exposure. We also don't think a schema account that people are filling in information from their schemas to be sufficient for explaining all these examples, because how often have we seen cornucopias in our life versus how often have we seen fruit? And so why would a cornucopia be part of our schema for a collection of fruit, right? Or if anything, our schema for Pokemon should be based around Pikachu, the most canonical character, right? Or the most popular character. So I'm curious to hear what you guys think, but I don't think a schema account can fully account for these errors. And so thus far, we don't have a unitary account for the effect yet. So a lot of future work is needed. This is still ongoing work. Okay, so to return to the outline of my talk, first, I told you about this idea of memorability, and I showed you that it is this intrinsic image feature reflecting the likelihood that someone will remember an image. And when thinking about what makes something memorable, well, our current hypothesis is that it reflects how we prioritize information in a memory space. And then finally, I showed you these surprising consistencies in people's false memory, where we find that, yes, there are some images we are more biased to falsely remember. And just to give you a quick snapshot into some of our ongoing and future work, right now, one of my entrepreneurial undergraduates is looking at true and false memorability in real-world settings. So using the pieces at the Art Institute of Chicago, we're looking at what are the intrinsically memorable and forgettable paintings as measured online, and can they predict what someone will remember when they actually go freely visit the museum and we test them on their memory afterwards. We're also looking at brain patterns related to memorability in individuals with impaired memory, specifically those with mild cognitive impairments or precursors to Alzheimer's disease. And what we're finding is that when you think about the images, you can find some highly diagnostic images that are memorable to healthy individuals, forgettable to those with MCI, and these can actually significantly predict group differences. So you can actually classify better if someone has MCI using this set of images than any other set of images. So none of this work would be possible without the help of all of my wonderful collaborators in my lab, which this is our lab photo because we were virtual until only recently. And yeah, also thanks to all of you, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts and questions.
All right, awesome. I hope everyone remembers that Pikachu does not have
I lose participants each time I give this talk.
All right, so we have time for some questions. We usually start with the students.
Hi, great talk. So I have a question about like the quality of memorability. I know that there's two types of memory, right? When you recall something versus just being familiar with something, and it looked like the faces was more familiar versus the words the study was looking at recall. And I'm wondering if you explored whether the qualities that make something memorable in those two contexts are different.
Yeah, good question. So with the words, we were finding that the more connected items were more memorable. And that was a recall task. So far for image recognition tasks, we're also seeing similar patterns. So for the 26,000 objects, I didn't have time to go into this deeply, but we're finding that those that were more typical in terms of their features also tended to be more memorable, not the ones that were more atypical. That being said, we have a whole other line of work I didn't have time to talk about where we have people study images and then draw them from memory. So really like visual recall task. And we are finding there that the items that people are better at recalling are not at all correlated with the items that people are better at recognizing. It's actually like there's no relationship between images with highest and lowest recall or recognition. So that does suggest there might be this different like recallability and recognizability at images that we haven't looked at yet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, great talk. I just noticed, so the three examples, the monocle and the Pikachu and the cornucopia, in all three cases, the false, more memorable one is you're adding something to the image to maybe help memory, like, oh, now there's a cornucopia, now there's monocle, now there's Pikachu tail thing. So is that like, is it just that you're adding new things, and so when we view the image looks like it's more memorable or something? Have you thought about that? Are there cases where taking something away makes it more memorable? Is it always adding?
Yeah, so in the examples I showed, it was adding something, though. Actually, for Pikachu, the correct version does have a brown base of its tail, so it's more like replacing something than adding something. But I didn't show some examples where actually it is that the correct version, or that people are taking something away. So one example is C-3PO, where he has a silver leg. Most people's false memories are that he has a gold leg. Another example we found was for Where's Waldo. He always has a cane with him, but people have a false memory that he doesn't have a cane. So it's not always an addition of a feature. Yeah.
What? Sorry.
Yeah, Where's Waldo? He has like a walking stick all the time. Yeah.
Crazy banana. Anything? Oh, sorry.
That was a super cool talk. I was wondering if you related some of the false memory stuff to some of the work you talked about earlier in the talk. So, you noted how you have like a deep learning model that can predict.
Oh, sorry, can you move the microphone a little closer?
Yeah, you noted that you have like a deep learning model that can predict people's memorability for different items. Does that model predict an increase in memorability for the items that people falsely recall to?
Good question. Yeah, so what we find is that memorability, in the sense of hit rates, is orthogonal from like a false memorability. So in fact, if you split up your items based on, you can imagine like 4 quadrants of like high hit rates, high false alarm rates, high hit rates, low false alarm, low hit rates, low false alarm, high false alarm, low hit rates. We find that each one of these quadrants are significantly internally consistent. So there are some images that cause a ton of false alarms and very few hits. Some images that people are trigger happy to and they have lots of false alarms, lots of hits. And so for the neural network, so far it's only trained on predicting hit rates. So we actually haven't tested how it does with false, or whether it tends to predict higher memorability for high false alarm images, but my guess is they would have no correlation. But definitely one potential future direction is to create one that also predicts false alarm rate, or one that predicts D prime or some sort of combined measure. Yeah.
Yeah, great talk. So the idea of this semantic network driving on the base is intriguing. So without those kind of core or hub components in the network relate to the typical, I mean, what is typical, what are typical items, like for one category, right? So so if you have, for example, dogs with that in pictures, right? Because you said it for words, it's easier to understand the structure, but you said for pictures, you said for objects, I mean, if you have, for example, a variety of animals, would that be kind of the most typical animal in that category, for example?
Yeah, that's our guess right now, though I do think it's probably a little bit more complex when you get to the images. Like it might be some relationship where semantically typical but visually atypical items tend to be the most memorable. What we were finding for the objects is these object images is that the most typical image of the category, so the most typical picture of a dog, tends to be more memorable with our object images. Yeah.
Like across categories?
Yeah, across categories, but it's still a somewhat weak effect. It's like we have these 1,800 categories. If we look at the correlation between typicality within each category and memorability, we see a slight positive correlation across all the categories where more typical ones are more memorable, but it's not such an overwhelming effect that memorability is just typicality. Yeah.
Thank you, that was a terrific talk.
Thanks.
I just wanted to ask a little bit more about this intrinsic memorability, which is the larger context in which it occurs. You know, the mad face in a series of mad faces, is that one face still going to be the most memorable? Or the differences across people, and eyewitness testimony, for example, there's the cross-race effect. And so I guess I wanted to just have you say a little bit more about how the memorability factor holds up across people, across context, and across orienting tasks that direct attention to different patterns.
Yeah, really good question. So the component of memorability that I'm looking at, I will claim is very context independent. So there is some work from Isabel Bultoff. This was a poster. They haven't published a paper yet, so I've been bugging them about it. But they looked at memorability and the other race effect with German and Korean faces and participants, and they were able to replicate the other race effect. So German participants did worse on memory for Korean faces. But what they found was that the rankings were preserved. So the most memorable Korean face to Koreans was also the most memorable Korean face to the Germans, and vice versa. We also find that this effect is very independent of task effects. So we ran a study where we had participants see face images with fixation crosses on them, and they had to do one of 3 tasks, perceptual tasks. They either had to judge the color of the fixation cross, judge the gender of the face, so like a deeper task, or judge how honest they thought the face was, so an even deeper task. And regardless of the task, people, when we gave them a surprise memory task, they remembered the memorable items better than the forgettable ones. So even when the face is not relevant, you're judging if the fixation crosses black or white, they will still remember those memorable items better than the forgettable ones. And so we haven't tried the most extreme manipulations of context, like putting only memorable items together and then seeing what happens. But there's some interesting work coming out of Keisuke Fukuda's lab at University of Toronto with working memory tasks, where they're finding that people are actually able to hold more memorable items in memory, in working memory, than forgettable items, which means that actually maybe these items might not even compete with each other so much. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, and actually you kind of just answered the question that I was going to ask. So I was going to ask if there's actually any habituation effects that you would see with memorability. So like say if you, like you just mentioned, if you cluster all the memorable items, you get kind of like a T+1 effect. So the T+1 item gets interfered subsequently.
Yeah, my understanding of their results is that they're not seeing that much interference for memorable items with each other, that actually your overall capacity increases. Yeah, and I guess I'm just going to spitball another sort of surprising, like context-independent result that I'm trying to wrap my head around. Nicole Russ lab at UPenn is finding that even rhesus macaques remember and forget the same images, which also suggests that there might be really just something that we're all learning very rapidly about our visual worlds early on that is resulting in these huge consistencies in what we remember and forget. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Right. I'll use it because I feel like it is a perfectly legitimate answer to say I haven't thought about that. So I'm curious about the representational similarity analysis result. So one thing that one would expect with representational similarity analysis is that the structure of that which is represented is preserved in the analysis. So you find that in all of these images there is a lot of similarity, using whatever correlation measure you're using. But when you look at the images that these parts of the brain are supposed to be representing, they are not so similarly correlated, right? Because the averages are not different between memorable and non-memorable. So this is a little bit striking if you think that what the brain is supposed to be doing is something like preserving the structural property of that which is represented. So have you thought of what this says about representational similarity analysis? Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so one of my thoughts is that what I've shown you so far is fMRI stuff. So we really don't have any of the sensitivity to what's happening over time. So I think what is possible is that we might have a representation that's more similar to what we're seeing in behavior early on. And then there is some work that's shown similar sorts of patterns related to subsequent memory, where items that you end up remembering end up being more similar, and those that you end up forgetting end up being more dissimilar. So I think it is possible what I'm picking up on here might be a sort of later processing stage for these items. So maybe if we could use something like EEG or MEG, we might actually see this inversion of the representations. Yeah, and one thing here is because we use these really extremely designed stimuli, it's sort of hard to look at. We really controlled for all these attributes between the memorable and forgettable items. So this isn't that well designed to look at subtleties and how people organize out the space for these items in behavior. But I think the important next step is to use a larger set of stimuli that vary along these features that we can quantify really nicely, and then see what aspects of the behavioral similarity space directly relate to the neural similarity space, so beyond memorability.
Yeah, I just need so I think we need to bring in the idea that the fMRI whole signal is also representing that are not information, that all of the release of dopamine and norepinephrine, those kinds of modulatory signals should also be represented. In fact, Jahala in my lab has some, I think, really nice analyses that go along with what you're saying to look at the non-information properties that are setting up before the images are perceived that might be reflected in the convergence of factors and similarities to a room variety. So I think we just need to keep open the mechanisms that we're imaging with fMRI to help understand this.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Well, one thing I know for sure, that this talk will be memorable.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for a great talk.